Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hey guys, so for today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Golden Pavilion mystery, but I'm changing up the structure of this episode a little bit because I received a message from a listener and I really wanted to share what she had to say. And I do want to preface this with a trigger warning for anyone who suffers from depression. You may want to just skip ahead to where the episode starts. So in my description for this episode, I will have a timestamp for when our talks about the Golden Pavilion start, but I felt like it was important to share what this listener said. So I was checking my email for the podcast the other day, which it is truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, and I had a message in my inbox from someone named Emily, and she just wanted to share with me her story about Nancy Drew as it relates to her depression. So Emily goes on to say that she is a first-time Nancy Drew reader. She got into the series pretty recently, but she suffered depression, and for 3 years she just completely stopped reading books. And she said, what they don't always tell you is that when you get really depressed, you aren't able to concentrate even on the things that you love. And Emily goes on to explain how hard this was for her. You know, it really made her confidence suffer, but she was able to work with a therapist to slowly start to read again. And she started with a small magazine article and then worked her way up to a middle school reading assignment. And then she decided to read the Nancy Drew series for many reasons. And she said it was because she'd never read the series before, and they're usually not more than 175 pages, and the characters are generally the same. And Emily also said that she's read 44 books now to date. Her goal is to read through the books chronologically, and that's kind of what we do here on the podcast too. And she said, this is a really big accomplishment for me, and Nancy Drew has proved to be one filled with inspiration, and she says that she's her fictional hero. And I just want to tell you, Emily, thank you so much for sending me that email, because I just was inspired to read about you and what you've gone through. And it's so amazing to connect with all of these people who have found courage and inspiration from this Nancy Drew series. And you've been really brave in sharing your story with me, so I want to be brave and share a little bit of my story as well. So a lot of people that follow the podcast know that in April 2023, I went to an estate sale with my dad and bought a bunch of Nancy Drew books on a whim and started rereading them. And then that led to me doing funny reviews of them on social media. And then that eventually led to this podcast. And I started this podcast in October of last year, and it has been such a fun thing for me to do. And it's been fun connecting with people all around the world who love Nancy Drew. And what Emily said about the characters being the same, that really spoke to me, because these books are very formulaic. You know, Nancy always solves the mystery and she catches the bad guy, and it's very comforting. It's almost like having that comfort TV show that you just turn on in the background for noise for no reason. Like, you know what the characters are going to do, and you know where they're going to go, where they're going to end up, and that can be a really big comfort for people who are suffering from depression or who are just going through grief or hard things that are going on in their lives. And I'm no stranger to grief. I believe that, you know, there are different sources of things that bring this depression into our lives, and sometimes it's hard to get up in the morning. And like Emily said, it's hard to find joy in the things that you once loved. So one of the hardest moments for me to overcome was back in 2018. My youngest brother was killed in a car wreck where the man went head on into his lane, and my brother was only 22 years old. And I could go really deep into this, but just suffice it to say, I am the oldest of 3 siblings, and there's a lot of guilt. Why am I still here? What could they have been doing with their lives? And I know you're thinking, what does this have to do with the Nancy Drew podcast and Nancy Drew books and Nancy Drew games? But these were such a huge part of my childhood, and I think in a lot of ways it's my way to reconnect with my brother. I remember reading these books, and we would be out doing things in the summer. You know, I'd be by the pool reading a book and he'd be swimming nearby, or we would play the games together. And so it helps helps me to remember him in a positive way. And the microphone that I actually used for this podcast was my brother's microphone. He used it for gaming, and he had made this huge gaming computer console from scratch. And so it's kind of my way to feel like he's a part of this. I use this microphone that he used, and it's just neat to be able to include him even in this small way. So my brother is a big part of my why for starting True Drew Podcast, and this kind of longing to go back to my childhood, the more nostalgic parts of it. And I just wanted to let you all know that you're not alone. If you ever want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast, or my email, which is truedrewpodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you all about what Nancy Drew means to you, what got you into the books, what inspires you about the books, because it's so neat to hear from different people about how they found Nancy Drew. And Emily, thank you so much for sharing your story. Reading 44 of the Nancy Drew books is such an incredible feat, and I hope you get to read many, many more. And thank you for encouraging me to be a little bit braver today as well. Now we'll jump into our episode on the Golden Pavilion mystery. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. My name is Avery, and for today's 41st episode, we're going to be talking about the Nancy Drew book, The Secret of the Golden Pavilion. So it's a little bit rainy as I'm recording this episode today, so I'm kind of excited to be transported and live vicariously through Nancy, because this book takes place in Hawaii. So this is actually the 36th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it first was published in 1959. And if you know anything about Hawaii, it became a state in 1959. So I feel like in writing this mystery, Harriet Stratmeyer Adams and her ghostwriters were just like, you know what, Nancy is going to be the first one to solve a mystery in Hawaii, so everybody else stand back. So as always, I love to discuss the book covers for the Nancy Drew books because they're so vivid and so different, and I was actually only able to find one for this book, but it's very interesting to look at. And if you ever want to see these book covers before the episode airs on Thursdays, I like to post these on Wednesday on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast. So the Secret of the Golden Pavilion cover is very blue and green. We've got this dark blue sky, and then we have the green grass and green of the palm trees. And we see who I believe are Bess and possibly either Dave or maybe Ned next to her. It's kind of the backs of their heads. And then we have Nancy, and everyone's, of course, wearing a lei because we're in Hawaii, if you didn't know. And there is this golden pavilion, and it looks kind of like an upside down flower. It's kind of weird looking, and what appears to be a ghostly figure doing a hula dance underneath it. So the funny cover spoof that I came up with for this book is Nancy and the mystery of what in the upside down water feature from a hotel pool is this. Do you guys know what I'm talking about? Because it kind of looks like one of those little upside down mushroom things that you see at hotel pools and stuff with the water streaming down from it. Like, I don't know, when I read Golden Pavilion, I'm picturing more of like a pagoda or something like really fancy looking, and this just, I don't know, doesn't look very golden. It looks more like sunshine yellow to me. It also kind of looks like something you'd see in Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, I'm not gonna lie. But as far as a magnifying glass rating for this cover goes, I gave it a 3 magnifying glass rating. It does kind of showcase Hawaii in some ways. You know, we have Nancy, Bess, and this unidentified man wearing these leis, and we have this pavilion and the hula dancing ghosts, so it's kind of interesting to look at, but it's not my favorite cover. Now, before we jump into the synopsis that I wrote for The Secret of the Golden Pavilion, I will list off some of the characters in this book. So first up, we have Mr. Sakamaki, and he is a person who is from Hawaii and has recently inherited this property, and he wants to have Carson Drew take on his case because there are some people who are claiming that they are long-lost descendants of Mr. Sakamaki's, I believe, grandfather, and these claimants are Ray and Janet Chatley. There's also a Mr. and Miss Pond who are neighbors to the Chatleys, Jim O'Keefe / Tim O'Malley, Mr. and Miss Armstrong, Ralph Imler, and I just put Fish Guy in parentheses, and then Mr. Sakamaki has a caretaker named Kiabu and his wife Emma, Mr. Dutton, who is a banker, and Nils and Stephen Anderson, which are professors. So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis. Nancy is returning from a dog show with Togo in a helicopter when she spies a burglar entering the third story of her home. She begs the pilot to contact air traffic control, and when she makes it home, it's discovered by Carson that a briefcase of his with important files for a case are missing. Mr. Sakamaki, who has recently inherited the estate of Kaluakua, has a mystery for them to solve. According to him, 2 claimants have said the land is rightfully theirs, and someone has been desecrating a golden pavilion on the property. Later, a hula dancing ghost is also seen. Mysterious things start to happen to the Drews as soon as they accept the case, including Togo being stolen and Carson getting attacked by a masked man at his office. Nancy, Bess, and George meet up with Ned, Bert, and Dave after a slight plane mishap the boys have, and not long after see a strange woman in a muumuu come out from under the pavilion, and someone sends Nancy a funeral lay. Nancy learns of connections to the Double Scorps gang and their love of stealing expensive artifacts, and begins unraveling the clues left by Sakamaki Sr. The Chatley siblings, who later turn out to be a fraudulent husband and wife, try to cause problems during estate proceedings, and Nancy almost gets killed by hot tongs at a luau. Nancy and Ned, with the help of others, find clues and discover the pavilion's secrets and capture the Double Scorps gang. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with that kind of just sums everything up is Mainland Mystery Solver. Nancy Drew solves family mystery and recovers artifact important to the Hawaiian people. So I hope you're ready to jump into the direct notes and quotes that I took down for this one, because Nancy almost getting killed by fiery tongs at a luau, like that's pretty intense. And also we're dealing with gang members, so it gets kind of crazy. So the first note that I took down is Nancy is just on a private helicopter with Togo coming back from a dog show. And I said it says Togo is wearing a blue ribbon he won. But this is such a bougie thing to do. I'm not gonna lie, if I had that kind of money, I'd probably be going to dog shows in a private helicopter too. But I was just like, Nancy she's just doing the wildest things sometimes when these mysteries start. And then, as if it's not crazy enough, Nancy is like, oh, let's go lower so we can see my house from the air. And so she asks the pilot to fly lower, but he can't. It's against regulations. But she sees that someone is breaking into her house on the 3rd floor. They've got a ladder propped up against the house. So she uses the pilot's binoculars and sees this person, and she asks the pilot to contact the authorities. So it's just so crazy. So the pilot does that for her, and so when Nancy finally gets home, Carson Drew's there, the police are there, and they're trying to figure out what this guy was even coming into the house for, and it turns out he stole Carson's briefcase, and Carson had just agreed to take on this new case, and so all they can think is that this guy wanted that information. And Carson says that he and Mr. Sakamaki were discussing his case out at a restaurant, so that's probably how this guy overheard about it in the first place. But Mr. Sakamaki himself says he doesn't really need Kaluakua, this estate that he's inherited, because he, quote, already has a beautiful home in Hawaii. And I said, I just want these people's problems. We got extra estates in Hawaii, we're going to dog shows and helicopters, what in the River Heights is going on? So Carson and Mr. Sakamaki discuss the case with Nancy, and Mr. Sakamaki says, oh yeah, I would love for Nancy to work on this, and he even volunteers to pay her way to Hawaii, and Bess and George's. I was just like, oh my gosh, I want Nancy's job. So the next note that I have down is Nancy gets help from a local librarian who directs her to a Professor Wharton who translates the Polynesian symbols that Mr. Sakamaki's grandfather wrote down. And it's determined by Professor Wharton that the symbols mean sleep, and then the other symbol either means death or water. And I was like, neither one of those sounds good. A watery grave, count me out. There's also the scene where Nancy sees a window washer using a collapsible ladder across the street from her dad's office. So she goes over there to question him because she's still trying to figure out who broke into their house. And the guy says he rented the ladder to a man named Jim O'Keefe the night before. I was like, I guess you can still rent ladders from Home Depot and places like that, but it just seemed kind of odd. But later on, while Nancy is following some other leads, she gets a call from Abe, who is the window washer, because he has something to tell her. So she and George go to see him, and he's up on the side of this house doing some work. And this man, jumps out of the bushes and tries to knock him off the ladder. So my next note is just Nancy is a cardio queen. She chases this guy for blocks and flags down a police officer, and they grab the guy as he's trying to climb over a fence. But apparently his name is Jake, and he's in some gang called the Green Tigers. So Nancy asks Jake, who put him up to messing with Abe's ladder, and he describes someone that Nancy thinks fits the description of Jim O'Keefe, the guy who rented the ladder in the first place. So apparently Jim O'Keefe has this weird tick where he drums his fingers and puts two fingers together. I don't know. Also, can we talk a second about how much gang-related activity is present in River Heights? Because we have this double Scorps gang, and then we have the Green Tigers. I'm just like, okay, there's a lot going on. I guess it keeps Nancy busy with her mysteries, but wow. So the next thing that I have written down is, oh my gosh, there's a hula ghost, which I was like, this is too perfect. I feel like whoever wrote this book was just like, what are all the stereotypes of Hawaii? We're going to have leis, we're going to have hula dancing ghosts, we're going to have Nancy almost getting killed at a luau. They went all out on the theme here. But on the bright side, Hannah actually gets to go on vacation, and she doesn't have to do much cooking at all. So I was like, yay, finally, Hannah's getting a break, because she deserves one. But her primary concerns with Hawaii seem to be volcanic activity and, quote, the different food. Which, I thought, okay, that's valid, Hannah, but, don't look a gift vacation in the mouth. So Nancy gets a call from Chief McGinnis about the burglar that came in the Drews' home, and he thinks that he's a member of the Double Scorps gang, and this gang has been targeting people who have certain artifacts that are Polynesian. So there was apparently a man who had a ring stolen by them that had Polynesian symbols that stand for water, death or sleep, again, woman, and tapa, which is apparently some kind of cloth. So this next note that I took down I thought was absolutely ridiculous, but there's a TV report on Ned, Bert, and Dave's plane having trouble over the Pacific, which I found this so hard to believe. But apparently the boys were on their way to Hawaii conveniently, so they're going to be there while Nancy, Bess, and George are there. But Nancy and Hannah and I think Bess and George and Carson are all turning the TV on, and then it's just breaking news. There's a plane over the Pacific that has a bunch of Emerson College students on it, and it's having mechanical problems, and I'm just like, what in the world? I mean, my understanding of the news is that they only report disasters, not play-by-plays of planes' mechanical problems. But Bess says that she doesn't want to go to Hawaii anymore because it's such a long flight. But she does change her mind when they hear that the boys' plane is okay and they've landed safely in LA. So this next note is something that just stuck out to me because I'm a full-time pet sitter, but I was proud of Nancy for thinking about Togo and his care while she was away. She, apparently takes him to this boarding facility out in the country, and he loves it. But before she can even take him there, Togo goes missing, and so she has to ask around and go to her neighbors and this kid named Tommy. And he says that he saw someone in a car lure Togo with a bone. So thankfully, Togo escapes this dog napper and comes back in the middle of the night. But I was just like, oh my gosh, not too many books ago, Togo gets hit by a car and now he gets dog napped. It's just, we need to keep Togo safe. So the next thing that I took note of is Nancy learns to hula from the Sakamakis. She comes over to their house and they're in the middle of practicing the hula, and she's at first I don't want to interrupt them. It's just kind of awkward, but she learns to hula and she knocks over an art piece of theirs and breaks it, and she feels really bad about it and offers to pay for it, but they're like, it's no big deal. Apparently Nancy's hips don't lie. So Carson Drew gets attacked by a masked man at his office who warns him to stay on the mainland, and Nancy goes by to investigate while the police are there taking fingerprints and everything, and she finds a scrap of tweed fabric at his office, so it's a clue to the assailant. I love how all these grown men and women police officers are there, and it's always Nancy, the teenager, that's like, oh look, here's this thing that you overlooked. So it's at this point in the book when Nancy, Bess, and George get on the plane to go to Hawaii, and apparently Nancy's seatmate is Susan Rossiter, aka Fran Johnson, like she has a stage name because she's an actress. And she says she's going to be playing a mermaid in a movie being shot in Hawaii. And she just like invites the girls to tour the film studio in LA during their layover. I was like, this would never happen. Like most of the time, like people are, I don't know, maybe it would happen. But I just thought that it was funny that they're just on their way to Hawaii. And this famous person is like, hey, come to Hollywood, come to this studio. I didn't write this down. I think there's like something that falls over or some lights explode or something. It was such a weird scene. I was like, you could probably take this whole part of the book out because it had nothing to do with the mystery, but it's like all this stuff goes wrong and then the set closes down and then Nancy, Bess, and George are like, okay, time to go back to the airport now. The next note that I wrote down is Ned, Bert, and Dave get to go to Hawaii too, and I said I love how the stars always align and they get to go on Nancy's mysteries. The more the merrier. Now, there's this couple called the Armstrongs, and they are the ones that pick the girls up from the airport. And they say, you know, this is the only palace in the United States. So they're talking about Iolani Palace. And in 1893, there was this group of men from America, predominantly, who had a vested interest in resources on the Hawaiian Islands. And they basically staged a coup and overthrew, and I'm going to pronounce this name wrong, but Queen Liliuokalani. And Hawaii didn't become a state officially until the year this book came out, 1959. But I said, yeah, there's a reason there's only this palace in the United States because it wasn't even ours. Like, we just kind of took over this land. And if you look up the history, it's actually really messed up. So everybody goes to stay at, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this too. I'm sorry, this whole episode is me butchering Hawaiian names, but Halakulani Hotel, and that's a real hotel. I looked it up. It's like a 4-star luxury place now, so that's pretty cool. So Nancy, Bess, and George meet up with Ned, Bert, and Dave, and Ned explains all the plane problems that they had, and apparently 2 of their engines went out on the plane, and I was looking this up because I was like, I know nothing about mechanical issues on planes. Thankfully, because I probably would never get on one ever again. But average plane has 2 to 4 engines. But I said that's still scary to think about. Like, if anything goes like wrong on a plane, like, and I'm on it, I don't want to know. But Ned says there was an annoying man who joined their group on the plane, and he drummed his fingers, and it was Jim O'Keefe. So the weird burglar / finger drumming guy has followed them to Hawaii. Great. But we do get some fun vacation moments, even despite Nancy having to solve this mystery. Nancy, George, Bert, Dave, and Ned race some other people on their boat. And it's while they're doing this that they see this woman in a white muumuu crawl out from under the pavilion and run towards the house. And then they hear a scream. But I was just like, how weird is this? Like, I don't know. Like, if I was just out on a boat minding my own business and I see some woman in a muumuu climb out from under like a gazebo, I'd be like, is she okay? So everybody goes back up to the house, and Nancy figures out that the reason the woman screamed was because she bumped into this statue that's holding a sword. And I think it's Bert or Dave is like, well, how do you know she did that? And Nancy's like, well, there's flesh and hair on it. So like, she obviously ran into it pretty hard. But it also mentions Nancy's magnifying glass. Carson apparently got her this for Christmas, and it says in the book that she calls it her pride and joy. Now, the next note that I wrote down is Nancy gets sent this anonymous purple and black lei, and Kiabu, who is the caretaker at Mr. Sakamaki's, yells at her and tells her not to wear it. It's for funerals. And so they look at it closer, and there's also tacks on it, and Nancy figures out that they're laced with poison. So she thinks it's from Ralph Imler, the strange fish guy who visited Mr. Sakamaki Sr. So this guy apparently came by before Mr. Sakamaki Sr. passed away, and he gave him this weird fish. So Nancy, George, and Bess also get to do some shopping while they're in Hawaii, and it says that they buy some monkey pod, which is a type of wood, and they get serving trays, bowls, and a few other things for their kitchens. But I come across this stuff a lot of the times when I'm thrifting, and it's kind of fascinating because the tiki motif was so popular in the 50s because Hawaii became a state, and it just kind of translated over to the rest of the country. So the next note that I have down is Ned spears this fish that's called an Aloha. I hope I'm saying that right. But this reminded me of the fishing we do in the game Creature of Kapu Cave, and I believe that Creature of Kapu Cave is supposed to be roughly based on this book, but there's no mentioning of like pineapple crops or anything like that. So it's very rough. It's probably just Hawaii is the only coincidence. The next note that I have down is everyone looks around the house for clues to the secret of the Golden Pavilion, and George finds this drawer under one of the tables with figurines in it that represent the different Hawaiian gods. So I was kind of proud of George. Usually it's Nancy that finds stuff. So now we're to the luau scene. So Nancy almost gets killed by some flying hot tongs that are thrown at her at this luau, and the guy who threw them gets away, but she's like warned in just the right amount of time by Kiabu, who's like, he like yells and she ducks. But I was like, this is going on the list of strange and unique experiences where Nancy almost dies, like almost killed by hot flaming tongs at a luau. I also took note of the fact that the girls wear muumuus and apparently the boys wear Hawaiian shirts to this luau. Oh yeah, and we get another instance of Nancy going skin diving. So Nancy and Ned go skin diving, and from the illustration in the book, they're just wearing flippers, a clear helmet, which kind of looks like a fishbowl upside down on their head, and an oxygen tank. So it's basically scuba diving, but without the wetsuit. Hence skin diving. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. That's what I figured it was this whole time, but it just sounds funny, skin diving. But they almost get attacked by a shark while they're out there, so that's kind of scary. So it's actually Bess and Dave that end up finding the trapdoor in the pavilion where that woman in the muumuu came out, and they end up finding this box that has a paper in it with the symbol meaning men. So I thought it was cool that a lot of the other people in Nancy's group end up helping her with this mystery. Okay, so at this point in the book, everyone goes to Maui to follow a lead on the silver sword plant, and Nancy discovers there are 2 twin professors that study them. So she thinks that this is what the clue men was representing, but before they leave, the Chatleys, the people who are claiming that this estate is theirs, move in claiming they have a right to the house. And I was just like, ugh, I don't like people like this. They're so annoying. But the executor of the state sends a guard over to make sure that they don't cause trouble. So Nancy almost meets her imminent demise near this volcano. Her and George almost fall in or off the volcano. The book is not very specific, but I picture them falling into the volcano because, more drama. But that's another thing we can add to the list of near-death accidents by Nancy Drew. For it being Hawaii and a vacation, she's almost died in very specific to Hawaii ways. Like, the only thing that's missing from this book is Nancy getting hit in the head with a pineapple. So Nancy follows her next clue from the professors that she got, and she and Ned charter a helicopter and fly over the Golden Pavilion. And the symbol in the middle means king, and they're able to see this from the air. But Ned goes up onto the roof of the pavilion to look into it while Nancy pretends to be the hula ghost, which I'm like, I don't know. She broke some art earlier in this book. I don't know if we should trust her for the hula portion of this distraction. But Jim O'Keefe shows up and he talks to Nancy thinking she's someone else in his ring of thieves. And when he leaves, Nancy helps Ned down, and he found a ceremonial robe up there on the top of the pavilion, like underneath something, I guess. But so Nancy and Ned try to run away, but these 4 men shove them under the pavilion. And they're eventually saved and the mystery is solved, but this was such a crazy mystery. So for the next part of this podcast, I like to do a segment called What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen, and Hannah did a little bit of cooking before they go to Hawaii. She made some angel cake and fruit juice because that's what I crave when my house has been burglarized, and hot chocolate and toast after everyone has stayed up worrying about Ned, Bert, and Dave's plane going down over the Pacific. And Hannah also makes some roast beef and lemon meringue pie, and once they get to Hawaii, there's some mentionings of pineapple and mahi-mahi, and then at the luau, they have pig, poi, fish, and squares of coconut pudding. So for the things that I said that Nancy could add to her resume, I said she's great at solving last wills and testaments for rich people that are really their thing to figure out, but for some reason they just can't be bothered to figure them out. And Nancy is a hula dancer. We never said that she was a good one, but she can put that on there. So for the things that I liked about The Secret of the Golden Pavilion, I liked the Hawaiian culture, but the things I didn't like, I said, how lazy is Mr. Sakamaki? I mean, I know that sometimes we need these people in Nancy's life because then she wouldn't have mysteries to solve, but I mean, it was his grandfather that left this mystery for him to solve, and he seems to be perfectly okay with just paying someone else to do that for him. So I gave The Secret of the Golden Pavilion a magnifying glass rating of 3 magnifying glasses. I thought it was a decent book. It wasn't my favorite, but it did have a lot of drama. I mean, we almost fell into a volcano and almost got speared by some fiery tongs at a luau, so it was at least interesting. So for next week's episode, we're going to be talking about The Clue in the Old Stagecoach. So if you like hidden treasure and Nancy being in a camp for most of this book, and of course, stagecoaches, then you will like this one. Until next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. If you'd like to stay up to date on the latest information and new episodes, our Instagram is True Drew Podcast. Or for general inquiries, you can email us at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com.